They called Colonel Mara Voss a boring army paper pusher for 15 years. My name is Mara Voss. I'm 43, a colonel in the United States Army, and at my sister's wedding last spring, she stood 3 feet away from me in a red satin dress and told her new husband's entire family that I worked some quiet desk job, nothing exciting, really. Her husband, a man I'd met only twice before that day, leaned toward his groomsman moments later and whispered something that visibly changed the color in my sister's face. "Colonel Voss runs black sites," he said, just loud enough for the small cluster around us to hear. "I've read the briefings. Don't let the quiet fool you." Before I explain how my brother-in-law knew details about my career that even my own sister had spent 15 years dismissing, let me take you back to where this particular family pattern actually started, because a single wedding reception doesn't create 15 years of casual condescension, it simply reveals it, all at once, in front of people who'd never questioned the story my sister had been telling. If you're the kind of person who watches a story through to the end, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. Drop your city and local time in the comments, I read every one. I grew up in Frederick, Maryland, the younger of 2 daughters. My father, Walter, worked as a high school history teacher. My mother, Judith, taught elementary music. My older sister, Cecily, 4 years my senior, had always been the more outwardly ambitious one within our family's specific value system, pursuing a marketing degree, then a series of increasingly visible roles at prominent firms in D.C., building a social circle and a lifestyle that photographed well and generated easy conversation at family gatherings. I joined the Army at 18, immediately after high school, a decision that had genuinely confused my parents at the time, coming from a family with no prior military tradition. What started as a practical decision, funding for college, a structured path toward independence, gradually became a genuine career, one I pursued with an intensity that surprised even me in those early years. By my late 20s, I'd been selected for increasingly specialized assignments within military intelligence, work that came with security clearances requiring me to discuss almost nothing specific about my actual daily responsibilities with anyone outside a very narrow professional circle. At family gatherings, when relatives asked what exactly I did, I developed a practiced, deliberately vague response: logistics and coordination work, mostly administrative, a description technically true in the broadest possible sense, while omitting almost everything that actually mattered about my actual responsibilities. Cecily, over those same years, developed her own narrative about my career, one built entirely from that vague description I'd offered, without ever asking meaningful follow-up questions. "Mara does some kind of paperwork thing for the Army," she'd tell her friends, her tone carrying the specific, dismissive lightness of someone discussing a sibling's unremarkable job. "Very quiet, very boring, honestly. I have no idea how she stands it." I didn't correct that characterization for years, partly because my actual work genuinely couldn't be discussed in detail, and partly because I'd grown accustomed to a specific dynamic within our family where Cecily's visible achievements consistently received more attention and celebration than whatever quiet, classified work I was doing thousands of miles away, in locations I couldn't specify, on projects I couldn't describe. By my mid-30s, I'd risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel, working on assignments connected to detention operations oversight and intelligence coordination that placed me, at various points, in direct operational authority over facilities and programs of considerable strategic significance, work that remained, by necessity, almost entirely invisible to my own family, who continued to understand my career through the same vague, outdated lens I'd established years earlier. Cecily married her first husband at 29, a marriage that ended in divorce 4 years later, and throughout that period and the years following, she continued building the specific family narrative that positioned her own visible, easily discussed corporate career as inherently more impressive than my boring paperwork job, a characterization I'd stopped actively fighting, exhausted by the impossibility of correcting a story I couldn't actually replace with accurate details. Cecily's second engagement, to a man named Julian Ashworth, came together relatively quickly, about 18 months before the wedding where everything finally shifted. Julian worked, according to Cecily's descriptions during family calls, in government consulting, a description as deliberately vague as my own had always been, though for entirely different reasons I wouldn't fully understand until the wedding itself. I'd met Julian only twice before the wedding, once at their engagement dinner, briefly, and once at a smaller family gathering the following month. Both encounters had been pleasant but unremarkable, Julian polite and reserved in a way that read, at the time, as simple social caution around a new extended family rather than anything more deliberate. The wedding itself took place at a vineyard outside Charlottesville, Virginia, a beautiful late spring afternoon that Cecily had been planning meticulously for over a year. I'd attended in a formal dress rather than my uniform, a choice I'd made deliberately, wanting the day to remain focused entirely on my sister rather than introducing any complication about my own career into an event that was, appropriately, about her. I stood near the edge of the reception during the cocktail hour, making polite conversation with several of Julian's groomsmen, when Cecily approached with her characteristic ease, introducing me to a small cluster of Julian's extended family with the exact phrasing I'd heard variations of for 15 years. "This is my sister, Mara," she said, her voice carrying the same casual dismissiveness she'd perfected over the years. "She works some quiet desk job, nothing exciting, really. I've genuinely never fully understood what she actually does all day." I smiled, the same practiced, patient smile I'd offered dozens of times before at similar moments, prepared to let the characterization stand without correction, the way I always had. What I didn't expect was for Julian, standing just close enough to overhear that exact introduction, to turn toward his own groomsmen with an expression I couldn't immediately read, and say something that would unravel 15 years of careful, deliberate vagueness in the space of a single sentence. I drove home that night in a silence that felt considerably heavier than the 90-minute journey usually warranted, replaying my mother's casual suggestion that I could, always just rent somewhere larger, while Preston sat 3 feet away holding an envelope containing more money than I'd saved across 9 years of disciplined, independent financial planning. I didn't confront my parents that evening. I've never been someone who processes anger quickly, and I understood, even in the moment, that whatever I said in the immediate aftermath of watching that envelope change hands would come out distorted by an emotional intensity I hadn't yet fully examined. Instead, I spent the following several weeks doing something I'd never previously allowed myself to do directly. I began cataloging, deliberately and honestly, the full financial history of how my parents had supported each of their children throughout our adult lives. I called my Aunt Priscilla, my father's sister, who'd always maintained a slightly more objective vantage point on our family's internal dynamics, given her own complicated relationship with my father over decades of sibling history. "Jordan, I've watched this pattern for years," she told me, once I'd laid out the specific details of that dinner. "Your father has always found it easier to rescue Preston from consequences than to simply let him build resilience the way you were forced to build yours. I think, somewhere along the way, your independence became something your parents took for granted, rather than something they recognized as requiring its own kind of ongoing investment and acknowledgement." Over the following month, I compiled, as precisely as I could reconstruct from memory and occasional documentation, a rough accounting of the disparity. Preston's private university tuition, largely covered directly by my parents, compared to my own loans for a considerably less expensive program. Preston's rent assistance during 2 separate unemployment stretches in his mid-20s. The co-signed car loan. Now, the $60,000 house down payment, delivered with ceremony and tears, compared to my mother's breezy suggestion that I simply continue renting if my current space ever felt insufficient. The total, once I'd added everything together as honestly as I could, exceeded $140,000 in direct financial support extended to Preston over the preceding decade, against essentially nothing extended to me beyond the polite, verbal acknowledgement of my own independent achievements. I met with a financial advisor, a careful, deliberate woman named Odessa Kilbride, specifically to understand my own actual financial position with complete clarity, wanting to make any subsequent decisions from a place of genuine strategic understanding rather than simply raw emotional reaction to what I'd witnessed at that dinner. "Jordan," she said, once we'd reviewed my full financial picture, "you're actually in a considerably stronger position than I think you've been giving yourself credit for. Your condo has appreciated significantly since your purchase, your retirement savings are well ahead of typical benchmarks for your age and income level, and you're consistent, Disciplined saving habits over the preceding 9 years have put you within genuine reach of purchasing a larger home on your own, without requiring any family assistance whatsoever. That consultation crystallized something for me that I hadn't fully allowed myself to consider directly before, that I didn't actually need my parents' financial support to achieve the same milestone they'd just handed Preston with ceremony and tears. What I needed, I realized, was to actually pursue that milestone deliberately, on my own terms, in a way that would make unmistakably clear exactly how capable I'd been all along, without requiring anyone's rescue. I found a property 3 weeks after that consultation, a modest but genuinely lovely 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood about 15 minutes from my current condo, priced within a range my own savings and a standard mortgage could comfortably absorb. I moved through the entire purchase process deliberately, quietly, informing my parents only once the closing had already occurred, the same pattern of independent decision-making I'd maintained throughout most of my adult financial life. I called my mother the evening after closing, keeping my tone deliberately neutral, informational rather than confrontational. "Mom, I wanted to let you know, I closed on a house today. 3 bedrooms, really lovely neighborhood, about 15 minutes from my old place." There was a pause on the line, longer than I expected. "Jordan, that's wonderful. I had no idea you were even looking. How did you manage the down payment?" "Through my own savings, Mom. The same way I've managed everything else over the past 9 years." Another pause, this one carrying a different quality, something closer to discomfort. "I wish you'd told us you were considering this. Your father and I might have wanted to help, the same way we helped Preston." I felt something steady settle in my chest, hearing that specific offer, arriving only now that I'd already demonstrated I didn't actually need it. "Mom, I think if I'm honest, I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure the offer would have actually materialized the same way it did for Preston. I watched you and Dad hand him $60,000 with tears and ceremony, 3 weeks after telling me I could just rent somewhere if my condo ever felt too small. I didn't want to find out, by asking directly, whether that same generosity would have actually extended to me." The silence that followed that comment stretched considerably longer than any previous pause in our conversation, and I understood, waiting through it, that I'd finally said something my mother couldn't easily deflect or reframe into a more comfortable narrative. We didn't resolve 15 years of family dynamics in a single conversation at the edge of a vineyard, but something genuinely shifted that afternoon, a crack appearing in a pattern that had calcified over more than a decade. Cecily returned to the reception with me, and for the remainder of the evening, I noticed a small but unmistakable difference in how she introduced me to the remaining guests she hadn't yet greeted. "This is my sister, Colonel Mara Voss," she said, to a cluster of Julian's colleagues near the dessert table. "Her work is considerably more significant than I've apparently been giving her credit for over the years." It wasn't a perfect correction, still vague in its own way, still avoiding specifics I genuinely couldn't discuss. But it was honest in a way her previous descriptions had never been, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, that the boring desk job narrative had been inaccurate all along. The weeks following the wedding brought a more substantial reckoning than I'd anticipated. Julian, it turned out, worked in a position with considerably more access to classified interagency briefings than his vague, government consulting, description had suggested, a role that occasionally intersected with programs I'd overseen directly during a particularly demanding assignment 3 years earlier. Cecily called me about 10 days after the wedding, her voice carrying a different quality than our conversations typically had, more careful, more genuinely curious. "Julian's been telling me things," she said. "Not specifics, obviously, he's very careful about that. But general things, about the kind of responsibility your rank actually carries, about oversight roles at your level. I think I've spent 15 years assuming Army officer meant something closer to what I understood from movies, without ever considering what an actual specialized career within military intelligence might involve. I appreciate you actually asking now, even if it's later than I might have wanted." I keep thinking about something Julian said, the day after the wedding. He mentioned that people in his field specifically respect officers who maintain genuine discretion about sensitive work, rather than those who leverage classified access for social status. He said your consistent silence over the years, rather than being boring, was actually a sign of exactly the kind of professional discipline that made someone trustworthy at your level. I felt something settle, hearing that, a validation I hadn't realized I needed until it arrived. That's a kinder interpretation than boring paperwork job. I know, Cecily said. I think I need to tell you something honestly, Mara, something I probably should have said years ago. I think I've spent our entire adult lives needing my own career to feel more impressive than yours, because your actual achievements were always somewhat mysterious to me, and mysterious felt easier to dismiss than to genuinely investigate. Why did it feel important to dismiss it, rather than just being curious? Cecily was quiet for a long moment before answering. I think, growing up, Mom and Dad's attention always felt like something in limited supply, something we were quietly competing for. My career was visible, easy to discuss at dinner parties, easy for them to brag about to their friends. Yours was invisible, classified, impossible to discuss in the same way. I think, somewhere along the way, I decided that made mine more valuable, rather than considering that maybe yours was simply harder to appreciate because of its actual nature, not because it was genuinely less significant. Over the following months, our relationship shifted in ways that surprised me with their consistency. Cecily began asking genuine, if necessarily limited, questions about my career during our calls, not seeking classified details, but showing real curiosity about the general shape of my responsibilities, the challenges of balancing a demanding career with personal life, the specific experience of navigating a professional world where most of your actual work remained invisible to the people closest to you. Julian and I developed our own careful, professional rapport during family gatherings, an unspoken understanding between two people whose careers occasionally intersected in ways neither of us could fully discuss, but who recognized in each other the particular discipline required to maintain genuine discretion within demanding, sensitive fields. My parents, once Cecily finally explained the full context of what had happened at the wedding, reacted with a mixture of surprise and something that looked, uncomfortably, like guilt of their own. We should have asked more questions over the years, my mother admitted, during a visit home that following summer. I think we fell into the same pattern Cecily did, treating her career as the interesting one simply because it was easier to discuss at church functions and dinner parties. I'm sorry we never pushed harder to understand what you actually did, beyond the vague descriptions you gave us. I understand why the pattern developed, I told her. I made it easy, honestly, by never insisting on more specific acknowledgement. I think I convinced myself that classified work meant I couldn't discuss any part of my actual professional identity, when really, I could have at least insisted on more accurate general descriptions, even without specifics. 8 months after the wedding, I received notification of a promotion board recommendation for Brigadier General, a milestone that would place me among a small number of women to reach that rank within military intelligence oversight roles. I told my family the news during a routine Sunday call, expecting the same measured, slightly confused reaction that had characterized most previous career updates over the years. Instead, Cecily's response carried a different quality entirely. Mara, I want to actually understand what this means. Not just congratulations, though obviously, congratulations. I want to understand what Brigadier General actually represents at your specific level of responsibility, so I can talk about this accurately with people, rather than falling back into the vague, dismissive descriptions I've used for years. I found myself, for the first time in our adult relationship, actually explaining the general shape of what such a promotion represented, the scope of responsibility, the years of specialized assignments that led toward this specific milestone, the significance within a career path that remained, by necessity, largely invisible to people outside a narrow professional circle. Cecily listened with genuine attention throughout that explanation, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real engagement rather than polite patience waiting for the conversation to shift back toward more comfortable, familiar territory. I think, she said, once I'd finished, I owe you a proper acknowledgement, not just at family gatherings but more broadly. Would you be comfortable if I mentioned your actual career, in general terms, to people who ask about you? Not specifics, obviously, just an accurate representation instead of the dismissive one I've maintained for 15 years. I'd appreciate that, I told her, meaning it genuinely. The promotion ceremony took place the following spring, a formal military event that Cecily and Julian both attended, along with my parents, marking the first time my entire family had witnessed, directly, the formal recognition of a career they'd spent over a decade quietly minimizing. Julian, during the reception following the ceremony, found himself in conversation with several senior officers whose work intersected with programs he had some professional familiarity with, conversations that reinforced, for Cecily, the genuine scope of the professional world I'd operated within largely unacknowledged by our own family. I keep thinking about that wedding, Cecily told me, during a quiet moment at the reception, watching Julian in animated conversation with a two-star general nearby. How close I came to simply continuing that pattern indefinitely, if Julian hadn't happened to overhear my introduction and said something. I wonder, sometimes, whether I would have ever corrected the story on my own, without that specific, uncomfortable moment forcing it into the open. I've wondered the same thing, I admitted. I think I might have continued accepting the vague dismissal indefinitely too, if that moment hadn't happened. I'd grown accustomed to it, in a way that felt easier than confronting the pattern directly. I'm genuinely grateful it happened the way it did, Cecily said. Uncomfortable as that afternoon was, watching my own husband correct 15 years of my careless assumptions in front of his family, in front of yours. I think I needed exactly that level of public discomfort to finally take the pattern seriously enough to actually change it. My promotion ceremony that day marked, in a way that felt appropriately symbolic, the formal culmination of a reckoning that had started, unexpectedly, at my sister's own wedding reception the previous spring, a moment where a stranger's whispered comment had exposed, in the space of a single sentence, a family dynamic that had taken 15 years to build and, remarkably, less than a year to genuinely begin repairing. 2 years have passed since that wedding reception where Julian's quiet comment first cracked open a pattern our family had maintained for 15 years. I now hold the rank of Brigadier General, overseeing intelligence coordination responsibilities that remain, by necessity, largely classified, though my family's understanding of the general shape of my career has grown considerably more accurate since that specific afternoon at the vineyard. Cecily and Julian's marriage has settled into its own rhythm, and their household has become, unexpectedly, one of the places where I feel most genuinely understood within an otherwise complicated professional life defined largely by discretion and invisible responsibility. Julian, in particular, developed a genuine, professional respect for my work that transcended simple family obligation, rooted in his own understanding of exactly what disciplined discretion within sensitive fields actually requires. My parents, in the years since, have made a consistent, deliberate effort to ask more accurate, more curious questions about my career during our regular calls, no longer settling for the vague, easily dismissed descriptions that had characterized our relationship for most of my adult life. I think about that wedding often, my mother told me, during a recent visit home. Not with embarrassment exactly, though there's some of that too. Mostly, I think about how easily we all fell into a comfortable story about you, simply because the alternative required more effort to understand. I'm grateful, genuinely, that something forced us to correct that before it became permanent. Cecily and I speak considerably more often now than we did during those earlier years of quiet dismissal, our conversations carrying a depth that simply hadn't existed when her understanding of my career remained frozen at some quiet desk job, nothing exciting. She's become, in her own words, aggressively accurate when describing my career to others, occasionally correcting people herself when they make the same casual assumptions she once made for 15 years. At a family gathering last winter, a distant cousin asked, in passing, what exactly I did for the army, using almost the exact dismissive phrasing Cecily herself had used for over a decade. Before I could offer my own carefully vague response, Cecily interjected directly. She's a brigadier general overseeing intelligence coordination, she said, with a directness that would have been unthinkable from her just 2 years earlier. It's considerably more significant than most people assume when they hear military job. I spent 15 years underselling my own sister's career because I never bothered asking real questions. I'm not making that mistake anymore. The cousin, visibly surprised by both the information and Cecily's uncharacteristic directness, spent the following several minutes asking genuinely curious questions, a small moment that felt, watching it unfold, like tangible evidence of exactly how much had shifted within our family's understanding since that afternoon at the vineyard. I think, often, about how differently things might have continued if Julian hadn't happened to overhear Cecily's introduction that day, if he'd simply let the moment pass without comment, allowing the same 15-year pattern to continue indefinitely into whatever future our family might have built without ever confronting it directly. What actually happened instead, an uncomfortable, public exposure of a dynamic none of us had been willing to name honestly, followed by genuine, sustained effort to rebuild a more accurate understanding between us, produced something considerably more valuable than the comfortable, dismissive story we'd maintained for over a decade. I still can't discuss the specifics of my work with my family, the fundamental nature of my career ensuring that certain boundaries will always remain in place, regardless of how much genuine curiosity my family now brings to understanding the general shape of what I do. But I no longer feel the particular loneliness of being quietly dismissed within my own family, replaced instead by a version of understanding that, while still necessarily incomplete, is finally built on genuine respect rather than convenient, careless assumption. Cecily's red satin dress from that wedding still hangs, I've noticed, in a garment bag in her closet, kept, she told me once, as a specific reminder of the exact moment she finally understood how much she'd been avoiding actually knowing her own sister. I keep it, she said, because I never want to forget how close I came to spending my entire life not really knowing you, simply because not knowing was easier than the effort required to actually understand. The end. It's been 2 years now since that first text message arrived at my forward operating base, since a casual, cruel dismissal about not being wanted for Christmas cracked open a fraud that had been quietly draining my identity and my trust for nearly 6 years before I ever discovered it. My mother remains in federal prison, with several years still remaining on her sentence. We haven't spoken since that single, difficult phone call following her arrest. I've made peace, as much as I think is currently possible, with not knowing whether we'll ever rebuild any kind of relationship once she's eventually released, and with the reality that whatever relationship might eventually exist will necessarily look completely different from the one I'd believed, for over a decade, that we already had. Gary completed his shorter sentence and reached out once, several months after his release, with a letter that read more like a careful legal apology than genuine remorse, an attempt, I suspected, to manage his own guilt and potential civil liability rather than authentic accountability. I haven't responded, and I don't currently plan to. I've rebuilt my financial standing, slowly and carefully, with the help of a financial counselor who specializes in identity theft recovery for service members, a resource I discovered exists specifically because cases like mine, painfully, aren't as rare as I once assumed. I've become, somewhat unexpectedly, an advocate within military circles for financial literacy and vigilance around family financial arrangements during deployment, sharing my story, carefully and selectively, with service members navigating similarly complicated family dynamics, hoping that awareness might help even a few of them catch warning signs earlier than I did. I think often about that specific phrase from my mother's original text, just family, and how completely it's been recontextualized by everything that followed. I understand now, with painful clarity, that whatever definition of family my mother had actually been operating under for those 6 years had very little to do with love, loyalty, or genuine connection, and considerably more to do with who remained useful, exploitable, and conveniently absent enough not to notice. I don't know if I'll ever fully resolve the grief embedded in that realization. But I've learned, through this entire difficult process, that protecting myself, legally, financially, emotionally, was never actually a betrayal of family loyalty, however deeply that instinct had been trained into me over years of prioritizing others' needs above my own vigilance. The Christmas after the trial concluded, I spent quietly, deliberately, with a small group of close friends who'd supported me through the entire ordeal, not the family I'd once assumed I understood, but a different, more honest kind of family, built on genuine trust rather than years of hidden exploitation I'd simply never had reason to suspect. Sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family that actually deserves your loyalty. It took a dismissive text message and years of carefully hidden fraud for me to finally understand the difference, clearly, and to begin building something more honest in its place.